Many years later, an old friend of mine contacted me, but later I realized that it would be better not to answer him. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, and I was halfway through binge watching a Netflix show I wasn't even particularly interested in. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting my lazy flow. Initially, I ignored it, assuming it was another spam notification, but something about the timing made me reach over. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Kyle. It had been nearly a decade since we'd last spoken. Back in high school, Kyle and I had been inseparable, partners in crime through every dumb decision and late-night adventure. But life had taken us in different directions. He'd moved to the city, diving into the corporate world, while I stayed local, working odd jobs until I found my footing. The guy I once considered my closest friend was now a distant memory. His message was blunt and unsettling. He needed a place to crash. No explanation, no small talk, just a favor out of nowhere. It didn't sit right with me. Kyle was the kind of guy who'd always prided himself on handling things solo. If he was reaching out, something serious was going on. I hesitated, debating whether to respond, but curiosity won out. I asked if he was okay, hoping for a quick answer that might ease my nerves. Instead, he shot back a vague reply, promising to explain when he arrived. He'd be at my place in 2 hours. No room for negotiation. When the knock on my door came, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The man on my doorstep barely resembled the Kyle I remembered. His face was unshaven, his clothes rumpled like he'd been wearing them for days. Dark circles framed his eyes, and his restless gaze darted around, scanning the street as though he expected someone to jump out at any moment. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside with an air of urgency, clutching a battered backpack like it contained his entire world. He mumbled a thanks, his voice low and strained. I watched as he paced the living room, occasionally glancing out the windows. His shoulders were hunched, tension radiating off him like static electricity. There was a weight in the air that I couldn't shake, a sense that whatever had brought him here wasn't just serious, it was dangerous. Kyle avoided answering any of my questions, brushing them off with vague reassurances that we'd talk in the morning. For now, he just needed a place to rest. I wanted to push, but something about his demeanor stopped me. He looked like a man teetering on the edge, one wrong word away from breaking. I showed him to the guest room and retreated to my own. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The image of Kyle pacing in my living room, his haunted eyes darting toward the windows, played over and over in my mind. Whatever he was caught up in, it was big. And for reasons I didn't fully understand, I had a sinking feeling I was about to be dragged into it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been light and restless, my brain unable to shut off after seeing Kyle the way he was. I crept out of my room, half expecting him to be gone, like the whole thing had been some weird dream. But no, there he was, sitting on the couch, staring out the window with a blank expression. His backpack was still clutched tightly in his lap, like it was a lifeline. The room felt heavy, the kind of silence that's loud enough to press on your chest. Kyle looked like he hadn't slept, and his ragged appearance from the night before hadn't improved. His leg was bouncing anxiously, his gaze occasionally flicking toward the window. I made some coffee, filling the air with its familiar, comforting scent. Maybe it would break the tension. "There's coffee if you want," I offered, keeping my voice casual. He didn't even turn to look, just shook his head and muttered something I couldn't hear. For a moment, I debated pressing him, demanding answers, but the look on his face stopped me. He seemed hollowed out, like whatever he was carrying had drained him completely. Instead, I sat across from him, nursing my coffee, waiting for him to speak first. Minutes dragged by, the silence thickening. Finally, he shifted, his grip tightening on the bag. "You're probably wondering why I'm here," he said, his voice low and hoarse. I nodded, keeping my tone calm. "Yeah, but only if you're ready to talk about it." Kyle hesitated, his fingers digging into the fabric of the bag. For a second, I thought he might open up, but instead, he just shook his head and stood up abruptly. "I need some fresh air," he muttered. He walked out the front door without another word. I watched him from the window as he paced back and forth on the driveway, scanning the street like he was expecting someone, or something. The unease that had settled in my gut the night before only grew stronger. Kyle was clearly in trouble, but whatever it was, he wasn't ready to share. And the way he was acting, it wasn't just stress, it was fear. By the time he came back inside, his hands were shaking. He muttered something about needing to lie down and disappeared into the guest room. I let him go, but the question swirling in my head wouldn't stop. What could have possibly happened to turn the confident, carefree Kyle I knew into this paranoid, broken version of himself? I glanced at his backpack, now abandoned on the couch. Part of me wanted to look inside, to get answers whether he wanted to give them to me or not. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat back down, sipping my coffee, staring at the bag like it might explode at any moment. Whatever Kyle was caught up in, I had a feeling it was only a matter of time before it spilled over into my life too. The day passed in an unsettling quiet. Kyle stayed in the guest room, barely making a sound. Occasionally, there'd be a faint creak of the floorboards or the murmur of his pacing, but he didn't come out, not even for food. The stillness in the house felt oppressive, like the air was too heavy to breathe. By the time evening rolled around, my nerves were on edge. Every sound made me flinch. A car passing outside, the groan of the old pipes, even my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. I told myself I was overreacting, letting Kyle's paranoia rub off on me. But deep down, a knot of unease had taken hold. Then, around 10 p.m., something happened that I couldn't brush off. While washing dishes, I noticed headlights sweep across the living room curtains. I didn't think much of it until the light didn't move on. Curious, I wiped my hands and peeked through the blinds. A black SUV was parked across the street. Its engine was idling, the faint glow of a cigarette visible in the driver's seat. It wasn't a neighbor's car. I knew everyone who lived on the block. Whoever it was, they didn't get out. I stood there for a moment, staring at the SUV. My logical brain tried to dismiss it, a delivery driver checking directions, or a friend of someone nearby. But the longer it sat there, the more the unease in my chest grew. Without thinking, I headed to Kyle's room and knocked softly. When he opened the door, his face was drawn and pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked even worse than he had that morning. I told him about the SUV outside, watching his face for any hint of recognition. The shift in his expression was immediate. His shoulder stiffened, and without saying a word, he pushed past me to look out the window. Standing behind him, I could see the tension in his body as he stared at the car. He muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible. That was when the knot of unease in my chest tightened into full-blown panic. Whatever was happening, it was far worse than I'd imagined. I pressed him, needing answers, but Kyle barely acknowledged me. He was too focused on the SUV, as though looking away might invite disaster. When he finally turned, his expression was grim. He didn't explain much, only muttered something about not expecting them to find him so soon. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever they were, they'd tracked him here, to my house. I demanded to know what was going on, but Kyle deflected. He told me to stay calm, like that was even possible. His eyes darted to the backpack he hadn't let go of since he'd arrived. For the first time, his voice softened. If anything happened to him, he said, I had to make sure whatever was in that bag didn't end up in the wrong hands. Before I could respond, a knock shattered the silence. It was loud, deliberate, and reverberated through the house. Kyle froze, his face going pale as he glanced toward the front door. His voice was barely a whisper as he muttered what I was already dreading. It's them. His face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with panic. The tension was suffocating as we crouched in the kitchen. Outside, The voices of the men grew louder, echoing through the night. One of them spoke with a rehearsed calmness, coaxing Kyle to come out. The words were steady, almost inviting, but they carried an undertone of menace that made my skin crawl. Another voice followed, sharper and more impatient, delivering a promise that if Kyle didn't cooperate, they'd force their way in. Kyle's grip on his backpack tightened as the footsteps outside began circling the house. Gravel crunched under heavy boots, each step deliberate and measured. He motioned for me to stay low and nodded toward the basement door. The message was clear. We had to move, and fast. We crept across the floor, each creak beneath our feet feeling unbearably loud. The basement door opened with a soft groan, and we slipped inside, pulling it closed behind us. Darkness enveloped us, the damp air thick with the scent of mildew and dust. I could hear Kyle's shallow breaths, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Then came the sound we were dreading, the crash of the front door splintering. The men were inside. My chest tightened as their footsteps echoed through the house above us. Their voices were muffled, but their tone was unmistakable. They were frustrated, angry, and determined to find Kyle. Kyle crouched against the wall, his silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of my phone screen. He motioned toward a cluttered corner of the basement filled with old furniture and boxes. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it would have to do. We pressed ourselves into the shadows, hoping it was enough. Upstairs, the footsteps grew louder, moving steadily closer to the basement door. My body tensed as I heard the creak of the door opening. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the stairs. One of the men spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. He sounded irritated, insisting Kyle wasn't there. The other man wasn't convinced and ordered him to search anyway. The flashlight beam moved slowly, scanning the basement as the man descended the stairs. The light passed over us once, then again, stopping briefly near the pile of boxes. My breath hitched as the man stepped closer, the beam narrowing in on our hiding spot. Kyle's body was taut, ready to move, the tension radiating off him like static. Suddenly, Kyle lunged. He grabbed one of the heavier boxes from the pile and hurled it toward the man, catching him off guard and sending him stumbling backward. The crash of the box hitting the ground was deafening. Kyle didn't wait for the man to recover. He bolted for the far door, his movements quick and instinctive. I scrambled to follow, my legs barely keeping up with the adrenaline surging through my veins. Behind us, the sound of shouting erupted, but it was distant and muffled compared to the pounding in my ears. There was no time to process what had just happened. All I knew was that we couldn't stop. Not now. The cold night air hit like a slap as we burst out the basement's side door, lungs burning from the rush. The world outside was eerily silent, save for the faint echoes of shouting coming from inside the house. My legs felt weak, but adrenaline kept them moving. Kyle was ahead of me, moving with a kind of desperation that made it clear he didn't have a plan, just a primal need to keep going. His grip on the backpack never loosened, as if letting go would mean losing everything. The yard was cloaked in shadows, the tall trees swaying in the faint breeze. We didn't speak, didn't stop to think. There was only the rhythmic pounding of our footsteps as we crossed the lawn, heading toward the narrow alley behind the property. I could hear the men inside the house now, their voices sharper, more frantic. They must have realized we were gone. The thought sent a chill down my spine. If they were this determined, what would they do when they caught up? Kyle ducked into the alley, his movements low and deliberate, his head constantly swiveling to check every corner. I followed, barely keeping up, my mind racing. I wanted to ask what the hell was going on, but there was no time, and the fear in Kyle's eyes told me he wouldn't answer anyway. We reached the end of the alley, where it opened into a quiet street. A street lamp buzzed faintly overhead, casting a dim orange glow that felt far too exposed. Kyle hesitated, scanning the area before motioning for me to follow him into the shadows of a parked van. For a moment, we crouched there in silence, catching our breath. My chest ached from the effort, but my ears were straining for any sound of pursuit. Then we heard it, a car engine roaring to life, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. My stomach sank as the black SUV from earlier turned the corner, its headlights sweeping across the street. Kyle grabbed my arm, pulling me further into the shadows as the vehicle slowed, creeping down the road like a predator stalking its prey. The SUV stopped, the engine idling ominously. My pulse thundered in my ears as the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, the figure exuded an aura of controlled menace, his movements calm but deliberate. Kyle leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. "We need to split up," he whispered, barely audible. The thought made my chest tighten. Splitting up meant I'd be alone, left to navigate a situation I didn't understand, while Kyle, who clearly knew the stakes, would be on his own. But before I could protest, he was already moving, slipping further down the alley, blending into the darkness. The man from the SUV scanned the area, his eyes sharp as he moved toward the sidewalk. Another figure emerged from the passenger side, following close behind. My hands clenched into fists, the instinct to run warring with the fear of drawing attention. Kyle disappeared into the night, leaving me crouched behind the van, heart hammering and mind racing. I was alone now, with no idea what to do next. I wanted to ask him what the hell was going on, but words caught in my throat. The air felt thick, suffocating. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Kyle's gaze flicked nervously between the door and the window, like he was calculating the odds of making it out unscathed. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat too loud, too fast. The knock came again, this time louder and more forceful. Whoever was outside wasn't here to chat. Kyle's hands were shaking, and I saw him make a split-second decision. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, his voice low and trembling. He grabbed his backpack and moved toward the back door. His steps were quick but silent, like he was trying to blend into the shadows. I didn't follow him immediately. I stood still, too frozen by the fear of the unknown. But something in the way he moved, so determined and panicked, snapped me back to reality. I needed to know what was going on. I crept behind him, trying to make as little noise as possible. But just as we reached the back door, another knock came. This one was even harder, the door itself rattling against its frame. I turned to Kyle. "What do we do?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his face tight. "Don't open the door. Don't answer. They're here for me, and if they know you're helping me, it'll be bad." The seriousness in his voice made my blood run cold. I never imagined I'd be caught up in something like this. Someone knocking at my door, looking for a friend who wasn't just in trouble, but in danger. But before I could say anything else, I heard footsteps from the front porch. Slow, deliberate steps. Someone was walking around the house, checking the windows. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to remain as still as possible, but my mind was racing. Who were these people? What had Kyle gotten himself into? Kyle looked at me again, his voice barely audible. "They're not just going to leave. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want." He turned and pulled me into the kitchen, away from the windows. We huddled in the shadows, listening. Outside, I could hear the sound of someone tapping at the windows. Then came the soft, distant voice of a man, muffled by the walls. "We know you're in there, Kyle. It's time to come out." It felt like the world had stopped, the silence pressing in. Kyle's grip tightened on the backpack. "Stay hidden. Don't give them any reason to think you're involved." I didn't even know how to respond. My pulse was hammering in my throat. I had no idea what kind of people we were dealing with. but it was clear they weren't going to walk away quietly. We were running out of time. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out beneath me. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I crouched behind a dumpster in a deserted alley, clutching the USB drive like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Kyle's last words echoed in my head, over and over. Make sure it doesn't end with them. After catching my breath, I pulled myself together and looked for a safe place to regroup. The streets were quiet, the distant hum of the city masking my hurried footsteps. Eventually, I found an all-night diner, a flickering neon sign casting its glow onto the wet pavement. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the smell of stale coffee and fried food filling the air. I slid into a corner booth, far from the windows, pulling out my laptop and the USB drive. My hands shook as I plugged it in, afraid of what I might find. The files loaded instantly, a cascade of documents, emails, spreadsheets, and videos. Every detail told the same story, an elaborate web of corruption and crime that stretched farther than I could have imagined. Politicians, CEOs, law enforcement, all of them tied to embezzlement, fraud, and even murder. The names and evidence were all there, plain as day. And then I found the video. Kyle's face filled the screen, battered and bruised, but his eyes burned with determination. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice steady, "it means I didn't make it. But this can't end here. Everything you need is on this drive. The people behind this will stop at nothing to protect themselves, but the truth needs to come out. Please, don't let this die with me." Tears stung my eyes as I watched him. Kyle had trusted me with this, his final act, his last hope. I couldn't let him down. I got to work, copying the files onto my laptop, then uploading them to multiple secure cloud storage sites. My heart raced as I set up scheduled emails to journalists, attaching the evidence and outlining everything Kyle had uncovered. Even if they caught me, the information would get out. Just as I hit send, the bell above the diner door jingled. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, scanning the room with calculated precision. My stomach dropped. I slipped out of the booth, keeping low, and crept toward the back exit. My fingers brushed against the USB drive, still in my pocket. A small but powerful reminder of what Kyle had entrusted me to do. As I pushed open the back door, the cool night air hit my face. I didn't stop to look back. The files were out now. Kyle's story wouldn't end here, and neither would mine. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt like we had a chance to win.